Thank you, Ceann Corda.
13 seconds more.
Thank you. Can I take this opportunity to thank all contributors to the debate on foot of the motion having been put before the House, and to acknowledge much of the content that was contained within much of those deliberations. I'm particularly conscious of the fact that many members of Fine Gael and Labour have acknowledged the housing crisis to be an emergency. I think one deputy from the West of Ireland Labour, Deputy Nolan, acknowledged that there was no shame in admitting that this is indeed a crisis and a failure of government to address that crisis in the way in which he had hoped over the last 5 years. And I find that most magnanimous on his part and the part of others, much more so than the deliberation, the contribution by the Minister whom has responsibility and has had responsibility for the last 2 years, Minister Kelly, last night. He spoke for half an hour. Much of the half hour was taken up in seeking to lay blame for this existing crisis, which has evolved during this government's tenure of office to be, in the hands of Fianna Fáil. Unfortunately, as Deputy Kelleher, Deputy Calleary and many others have alluded to, the facts speak for themselves. The statistics speak for themselves. The statistics state the case of which we are certain and of which the Dáil should have no doubt, and that is that during the course of the last Dáil, the last government built 3,600 units per annum, whereas this government is building 300 units per annum. That's it in a nutshell, really. But it doesn't surprise me, because it has been synonymous of this government over the last 5 years to lay blame when confronted on various amount of issues with the previous government, considering the success they had in doing so at the time of the last election, but failing to acknowledge the great responsibility that was placed on them and the great expectation that was expected of them by those who gave them that privilege. And I'm conscious of saying that in the context of the publication of the banking inquiry today. That too does not carry the sort of weight or the launch pad that the Taoiseach and others would have hoped it would have for their campaign as we enter into an election. Without having read it, and I don't want to go into it in any great detail, but many would say it's interlinked with the debate we're having today, considering the sort of blame that the government places on ourselves for our supposed role in the crisis that exists for many people who find themselves part of the 130,000 that are on a waiting list. No mention, for example, in that, I'm led to believe, in relation to any axis of collusion that was supposedly to have existed between our party and builders and bankers, according to the Taoiseach. No mention of acts of treason by any member of the last government, as was alleged by Deputy Gilmore to the catcalls of his colleagues. No mention of there having been documents shredded in the then Taoiseach's office, now occupied by Enda Kenny, considering the fact that he said that he had sought to find those documents despite the fact that they had been in the hands of the Department of Finance. Rather, I believe there was confirmation of the fact that the central bank and the regulator assured the government then of the solvency of Irish banks. So you have form in that regard, and that has been your form and the form of this government over the last 5 years, as I said, when confronted with issues and failures on the part of the government. And the public have noticed that and have paid attention to it and have reminded us of that in the last number of weeks. And we too acknowledge the result of the last election and wished you well on entering government, and commend you for having completed the job of bringing income and expenditure into line, considering that the last government had done 2/3 of the heavy lifting. The means and methods by which you went about it in relation to this issue, for example, leaves a lot to be desired. And you continue to throw out figures that you think can pull the wool over our eyes, but more importantly, you think you can pull the wool over the public. And as Deputy Kelleher has alluded to, when Minister Kelly said here last night there were 13,000 keys handed out last year, that's not true. You know it, Deputy Coffey. You know that to be the truth. 2,700 of them were vacant units that were refurbished. And that's nothing to be proud of. When they were constructed and built many years previously, there was nothing in the contract to say leave them idle for 2 years after 10 or 15 years. And you want to pat on the back for refurbishing them. The problem as to why they needed to be refurbished, because you failed to put in place a tenant purchase scheme that would fund local authorities and give them the capacity within their own funding streams to be able to make sure that they were turned over regularly. No, you've allowed the issue of 30,000 cap remaining. You've allowed the issue of local authorities needing the approval of members of staff in the Department of the Environment before they can proceed to do so. You mentioned 9,000 are in various leasing programmes. Many of those leasing programmes, there was a changeover from RAS to HAP. So you're just, you're renaming things and you're giving the impression that keys were handed out. They weren't. The other point he made was that our proposal was somehow breaking the law in relation to the provision that's contained within the legislation that gives effect to NAMA, that the Minister for Finance cannot direct NAMA to construct houses for the benefit of the state, despite the fact that there was an implicit clause in that legislation that there should be a social dividend for the state. And if it's illegal, why then did he direct him to build 10% only for social housing? Sure, if it's illegal to build 50%, it's illegal to build 10%. And then you say, and the Taoiseach said it last week, it would cost $2 billion. Then he said on Sunday it would cost $3 billion. So he doesn't know, he hasn't a clue, to be quite honest. But the truth is, you say there was no funds and we were broke. The credit unions, which you have scant regard for too, considering what you signed, which our government signed in recent weeks, they've $2 billion on deposit in the pillar banks, as you call them, propping them up. And they are not allowed the scope to invest in this sector, to invest in their communities, to revitalise their communities, to allow for them to make a telling contribution in their communities. And then he said that NAMA owned the loans, not the land. For God's sake, sure, the land is the security that determines the value of the loan. The return on the investment in the land will repay the state. But no, you see, the Fine Gael attitude is that we get as much as we can and we throw it into the public finances to show the improvements we've made in those finances, and to hell with those within the state who can't afford to provide a house for themselves in the absence of the government doing so. That's the difference between Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. That's the difference between what this government has done for the last 5 years and what we will do in the next 5 years. And we look forward to engaging with the public and having the opportunity to say to them that we can do things differently, we can provide, and we can allow the fruits of success in this economy which we all strive for. But we can give it to those that can benefit. We won't just look at the 30 to 35% that you believe will win you an election. Because there was a time when governments had to get 50% of the vote to win an election. Thanks. And there is a time still, believe it or not, when parties and political organisations want to satisfy and help all of society across this republic, especially in the year that's in it and the commemoration it signifies.
I now put the question